Hi, folks. I am back and I'm glad to be back. As you could tell from my short experiment video a few days ago, I'm kind of getting back into the swing of things. Now, before I go into a big topic with a sort of structured monologue, let me acknowledge the absolute insane news since I last posted before my vacation. It's fucking nuts how much has happened. And frankly, it's really tough to just pick one thing to talk about right now. On the international front, we're seeing accelerated gains by Russia in Ukraine, unfortunately. And at this new pace, it's looking more likely that they could finish conquering those four key regions by the end of the year, or maybe within 2 years, depending on how things go. This is obviously something we could dive into in more detail. Related to that is the US and Ukraine mineral deal and the ongoing negotiation where the US continually represents Putin's ideal wish list as their proposal. And in the US, you're navigating a significant crisis of confidence in American democracy with the absolutely mind boggling news of American children, citizens with cancer, being deported without due process by pro lifers. And just last week or so, depending on when you're listening, there was another ridiculous press conference with President Trump and President Cyril Ramaphosa of South America, which was an even more blatant and racist setup and hit job than the one between Trump and Zelensky a couple of months ago. I mean, like with actual like TV screens, right? And the ability to dim the room and everything. It's like, wow. And then looking over at Germany, we've also seen major political shifts. The AfD briefly became, for the first time, I think, the strongest polling party in Germany, largely as a protest, I think, to the perception that Friedrich Merz has conceded way too much ground on immigration to the other parties, to the SPD in particular, as part of the coalition talks. And speaking of Germany, it's also worth noting the recent news that Gerhard Schröder, the former German chancellor who became infamous for his ties to Russia and taking a executive position on Gazprom, was just cut off from receiving payments through Russian channels last week that were just recently discovered. And I think it's really crazy that it really makes me wonder why the SPD didn't already completely dissolve and reconstitute itself with a new name, back in 2005, right? Um, and then, of course, we've had Trump's battle with Harvard in the news, really testing the boundaries of how much power populism can hold over the country, including academia. And I think also how racially and culturally intolerant a fascist can be while constantly professing some over exaggerated pro Semitism to hide himself from the Nazi label, right? It's just no, right? I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. You can't just pick one minority and say, this means everything's fine. Now, you know that this channel isn't about being a daily news tracker and running commentary on everything. There are far better people out there for that. Jon Stewart, John Oliver, Jake Burrell, of course, for Ukraine, and countless others. This channel is more just a log of my thoughts and the occasional observation, something that's going through my mind and that I feel I want to get out there. But with so much happening, it's very hard to ignore it, and it's even harder to choose what to focus on. Like if I had been here the whole last, month and a half, 2 months, then there would have been a lot of episodes about a lot of these things as they happened. And instead, what I want to do today is I want to tie a couple of those threads together. And surprisingly, the Pope is at the center of my thoughts, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Because the death of Pope Francis and the historic conversation between Zelensky and Trump at the Vatican really got me thinking, does the Pope still matter at all? Right? While he was alive, did he accomplish anything? Then he died, and got a little bit here. But why, right? Why? How much does the Catholic Church matter, and how much does it matter who leads it? And then when I was thinking about that, I was struck by an article about the mourners who came out for Pope Francis, and it actually mentions hundreds of thousands. In fact, about 250,000, which sounds impressive. I mean, they made it sound impressive, 250,000 mourners. But my immediate reaction was, that's it? Like, think about it. The Pope is historically one of the most important figures in Western civilization. All right. Even if you're not a Catholic, the religion he leads is at the root of Western civilization. And when I was growing up, the Pope was omnipresent in the media, a consistent part of the narrative of world history and foreign policy, including influencing the end of the Cold War. And why was that? It was because the Pope at the time was Pope John Paul II, broadly considered probably the most charismatic pope in centuries. And Now, popes aren't chosen for charisma, right? That's fair. I accept that. Like they're chosen through deep reflection and prayer by those who've dedicated their lives to their God, trying to reflect on their best spiritual representative and who is God's voice on earth to some extent, right? But it was still a stroke of luck, I think, that they chose John Paul II. And I think that his charisma had a hugely positive effect on the church, and I think actually arguably on history. Things changed a lot with his successor, Pope Benedict, previously known as something Ratzinger. He was frankly incredibly uncharismatic and even had questions about maybe having a Nazi background because he was this old German. And participation in the Catholic Church just collapsed, right? The Pope became basically invisible to the wider world. He hid. When Pope Benedict died, I don't think very many people noticed. He'd already resigned years earlier. In fact, did you know he just died 3 years ago? So then Pope Francis came along. Right? He definitely had more charisma and character than Benedict. And we've seen the church in the public light, I think, a bit more positively again. But church attendance hasn't recovered, and I think it's actually still dropping. And I actually kind of think that Pope Benedict had such a disastrous effect that it might take multiple good choices of Pope to actually really like turn things around. This whole train of thought led me to a bigger idea. How much value, or rather a more generalized idea of like how much value does an organization gain or lose based on the charisma of one leader? Because really, we don't want to think of, I don't really want to think of like one leader. I think that things are a team effort. I think that dynamics are important. I think that systemic effects on companies are important. I think there's so many things you want to do to fine tune like an actual organization at the core to be productive and efficient and effective. But how much value that organization actually has in some circumstances is absolutely dependent on its public face. So, for example, political parties, even countries, religious organizations, of course, where you draw in followers, and of course, publicly traded companies. And I think that last one is where we can really use a financial test bed, sort of an economics effect, to test this hypothesis. And so I'm going to look at like Tesla and Elon Musk, for example, right? Even though Musk's Nazi saluting and incredibly racist cuts to the US government, which, by the way, he literally cut the smallest amount possible for the maximum amount of harm he could possibly do to minorities worldwide. Okay? There is nothing more racist and more evil he could have possibly done than exactly what he did. And that actually spilled over and wrecked Tesla's reputation and drove international sales into the ground. But what happened was Tesla's shares rebounded after he officially returned to the company, right? While you would have thought maybe that Tesla's only hope at this point was to find some way to get rid of him permanently. But the problem is there is no Tesla without Musk, right? Everybody associates these two way too much. And to me, that's like just a sign like how much it matters that a company has a charismatic leader, how much of a difference that can make, and just what that company can get away with, what that organization can get away with when the leader is charismatic and popular to enough of the public. And not everybody, of course, right? Just enough. And the people that he's appealing to, he has to appeal to very, very strongly, or she, by the way. Back to Angela Merkel. So Elon Musk has this almost magical ability to draw people in and to make them feel like they understand his vision, which is often wrong. And it doesn't matter because most people wouldn't know the difference between it being right or wrong. And what's more important is that they feel they understand and that he's somehow speaking to them and what they care about. And that he's saying things that they think no one else is willing to say. And Musk brought Tesla to a point where it was almost one of the most valuable companies on the planet, while it was having one of the smallest revenues of any car company and no profit for like a very long time. I don't remember. I'm too lazy to look it up, like at least a decade, right? Compare that to other massive companies like Microsoft or Google. They're fundamentally valuable, highly profitable, and have huge revenue. But their stock valuations aren't nearly as inflated relative to their fundamentals because their leaders, even though they're very intelligent, just aren't this kind of charismatic public figure. Even Microsoft is a great example. They did incredibly well under Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, who, let's be honest, was famously crazy in public, doing these huge emotional displays, and people liked that. Microsoft is now infinitely more valuable than it was in the Ballmer days in terms of fundamentals. It's diversified into cloud, data centers, gaming, defense contracting, and some special tech that we probably don't know about. But back then, it was mostly just an operating system, and it completely missed the boat on tablets and phones. But the perceived value driven by those frontmen was still very high. And I think the same principle, of course, applies to Donald Trump, even though it's really not something we want to talk about. But like, he's somehow likable to a lot of people despite his track record of a lot of problems. Why? Because the way he presents himself, this uncontrolled nature, somehow strikes people as more genuine. And the fact that he's just saying what's convenient for him in the moment can seem more authentic to people even than some rehearsed focus group tested politician trying to stick to talking points, which I will be perfectly honest is frustrating the shit out of me. Like, there is no Democrat right now actually taking a stand for anything except, I think, AOC. And by the way, I don't think the Democrats should be shy at all about putting AOC front and center. I think it shouldn't matter at all that what she has to say isn't what focus groups now currently generally agree on is probably, the best intersection of whatever may be popular or unpopular enough, right? Like, that sort of logic isn't going to get you anywhere. There's no leadership in it, and people know it, right? Yeah. So my takeaway is charismatic leaders and leaders that have something to say, right, matter a lot, and they can add an insane and sometimes irrational amount of value to an organization in terms of public perception, and consequently, it's the real world influence of that organization and its valuation. So from the early 1980s to 2019 or so, for example, we also saw Germany's influence in Europe and the world grow drastically under the leaders Helmut Kohl, who, believe it or not, had his own kind of charisma, actually a lot, and Angela Merkel. And also don't underestimate her charisma. By the way, even if her sense of humor was very German, like you probably never heard one of her jokes because the American media wouldn't know how to put it in English, but they were amazing. Some of very, 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 very cool. The whole dynamic makes me wonder about this channel, of course, because I'm definitely not that like outgoing, charismatic public face and stuff. So we'll see how this works out. But that's it. So that's what's on my mind today. I'm glad to be back and getting back into this. I'll follow up on some of these topics that I mentioned. And one thing that's going to be really important, I think, also to dig into, and I've needed to for a long time, is whether there's any chance at all of Putin actually stopping in Ukraine, or if he'd ever accept just a small chunk of it. And for that, I think we'll need to dive into the incentives of the individuals who ultimately make those decisions, like Putin and Zelensky in terms of the negotiations that are going on, and not just like countries or what seems fair in the way that you might think that this is being mediated or negotiated. And I hope you'll find that interesting. I might also do a little random aside at some point about why Elon Musk's rockets keep blowing up, or why we may not want to put data centers into outer space. I know it's out of left field for a foreign policy and politics channel, but I just have trouble keeping my thoughts on this to myself, and it'll involve some fun sketches and maybe even 3D modeling. Actually, that means I'll probably never find time to do this. Anyway, so that's probably what's coming up for the channel, and that's all for today. I'm grateful for everyone who's watched my first video already from last weekend. And it takes time, of course, for the algorithm to realize I'm back and start distributing my stuff again. But if this is your first time seeing me, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, drop me a comment and a thumbs up. It's the best thing you can do for the channel. And I'll do my best to share my thoughts on these topics and anything else that develops in the coming weeks, months, years, as long as I'm here. And as always, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And if there's anything you disagree with, agree with, have any other observations, let us know in the comments. Bye.